Have you ever stood in your own home, in your own life, and suddenly felt like a stranger to your own memory? That's exactly where I found myself on an ordinary Tuesday evening, chopping vegetables in the kitchen ID decorated, listening to my husband laugh at something that should have been simply conversation we'd had just days before. "That never happened," he said, and those 3 words landed like a punch I didn't see coming. But hey race, what nobody tells you about gaslighting, the moment that finally breaks the spell isn't always the worst moment. Sometimes it's the most mundane one, the one that's happened 100 times before, except this time, something inside you simply refuses to break. If you've ever questioned your own sanity in a relationship, if you've ever found yourself apologizing for remembering things wrong, if you've ever felt crazy for trusting your own mind, this story is for you. Because what happened in my kitchen that night wasn't just about one denied conversation or one controlling laugh. It was about recognizing a pattern that had been stealing my reality for years, disguised as love, wrapped in humor, delivered with a smile. The toxic marriage I was living in didn't look toxic from the outside. There were no screaming matches, no obvious cruelty, just a steady, quiet erosion of everything I knew to be true. But hey race, the controversial truth that changed everything for me: you don't heal from emotional manipulation by convincing your manipulator that you're right. You heal by simply deciding that your truth doesn't need their approval. That realization, that one shift in perspective, was more powerful than any argument I could have won, any evidence I could have presented, any apology I could have demanded. And in this story, I'm going to show you exactly how silence backed by unshakable self-trust became my most powerful weapon, how kitchen gaslighting became the catalyst for my freedom, and how that never happened finally became the lie that set me free. What if I told you that the person trying to make you doubt your reality is actually the one living in denial? What if the controlling husband pattern in your life is only powerful because you're still asking for permission to trust yourself? Stay with me, because this female empowerment story doesn't end where you think it does. It ends with a question that might just change your life. Whose version of reality are you living in, and what would happen if you chose your own? Sarah stood at the kitchen counter chopping vegetables for dinner, the rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board filling the comfortable silence. It was one of those ordinary Tuesday evenings, nothing special, nothing alarming, just the two of them settling into their domestic routine after long workdays. The scent of garlic and olive oil hung in the air, and she found herself relaxed, her emotional guard completely lowered. This was supposed to be their safe space, the place where honesty lived between the wine glasses and the worn cookbook pages. "Remember last week when you promised we'd visit my parents this Sunday?" she asked casually, glancing over her shoulder at Mark, who sat at the kitchen table scrolling through his phone. Her tone wasn't accusatory, just a gentle reminder about plans they'd made together over breakfast just days ago. She expected a simple confirmation, maybe even an enthusiastic "of course I remember," because that's what partners do in healthy relationships. The conversation felt safe, almost mundane, like discussing what movie to watch later or whether they needed more milk. Mark looked up from his screen, and that's when she saw it had familiar flicker in his eyes that she'd learned to recognize but hadn't yet learned to name. He set his phone down slowly, deliberately, like someone preparing to deliver news that would change everything. "Visit your parents?" he said, his voice carrying that peculiar blend of confusion and amusement that made her stomach tighten. Something in his tone suggested this wasn't going to be the simple exchange she'd anticipated. "Sarah, we never discussed that," he continued, and then came the laugh, soft, almost affectionate, but with edges sharp enough to cut. It was the kind of laughter that makes you question your own memory, your own reality, your own worth. She felt the knife pause mid-chop, her body registering the emotional manipulation marriage dynamic before her mind could catch up. In that toxic marriage story moment, standing in her own kitchen with a man who'd promised to love and honor her, she felt the ground beneath her perception begin to shift. The laughter continued, filling the kitchen like an unwelcome guest who doesn't know when to leave. Mark's chuckle wasn't cruel on the surface, it had that practiced quality of someone who'd learned to weaponize humor, turning denial into something that looked almost playful. "That never happened," he said again, shaking his head with exaggerated disbelief, as if she'd just claimed the sky was green or that cats could fly. His smile remained fixed, perfectly calibrated to make her feel like she was the one being unreasonable, the one who couldn't take a joke. Sarah felt her memory being reframed in real time, like watching someone edit a photograph until the original becomes unrecognizable. She could see the breakfast table in her mind, the sun streaming through the window, the coffee mugs, his exact words about clearing his schedule for Sunday. Yet here he sat, this controlling husband, casually erasing that reality with nothing more than a laugh and a dismissive phrase. The gaslighting technique was so smooth, so practiced, that she almost found herself doubting what she knew to be true. Almost. "You're probably thinking of something else, babe," he added, his voice dripping with that condescending sweetness that makes emotional manipulation so insidious. He stood up and walked toward her, placing a hand on her shoulder as if comforting a confused child who'd mixed up her days or forgotten an important detail. "You've been so stressed at work lately, maybe you dreamed it." The suggestion hung in the air like poison disguised as medicine. This was psychological dominance being asserted without a raised voice, without obvious aggression, just pure control wrapped in concern. She could feel him watching her face, waiting for the moment when she'd crack, when she'd apologize for her confusion or laugh along with him to smooth over the tension. This dark relationship drama had played out before in different variations, her bringing up conversations they'd had, promises had made, things had said, only to be met with that never happened and that same infuriating laugh. The kitchen gaslighting moment crystallized something in her mind, though she didn't yet have the words for what she was recognizing. The controlling husband pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The laughter didn't stop, it just shifted into something quieter, more dismissive, like background noise meant to remind her of her place. Sarah turned back to the cutting board, her hands moving mechanically while her mind raced through 1,000 responses she couldn't voice. The feelings swelling inside her chest, frustration, confusion, anger, were being systematically dismissed without him ever raising his voice or showing a hint of actual anger himself. That was the cruelest part of this toxic marriage story. The absence of obvious conflict made her feel like she had no right to be upset. Her lived experience was being minimized in real time, reduced to nothing more than a figment of her stressed imagination. Mark returned to his phone, the conversation apparently over in his mind, the matter settled simply because he'd decided it was settled. She wanted to scream, to pull out her calendar, to prove that the conversation had happened exactly as she remembered it. But something in his casual dismissal told her that evidence wouldn't matter. Find another way to twist reality, another that never happened to deploy, another laugh to make her feel small. The protagonist inside her, the woman she used to be before this marriage, before the constant second-guessing was being made to doubt herself with surgical precision. Am I losing my mind? She wondered, a question that had become far too familiar over the months and years. Did I really imagine that conversation? The self-doubt crept in like fog, obscuring the clear memory she'd held just moments before. This was the gaslighting effect in full force, not just denying reality, but making the victim question their own sanity, their own perception, their own worth. Compliance was expected. That much was clear from the way he'd already moved on, scrolling through social media as if nothing significant had just occurred. He expected her to swallow her feelings, to let this moment pass like all the others, to continue chopping vegetables and making dinner as if her reality hadn't just been erased. The emotional manipulation marriage dynamic thrived on these silent humiliations, these moments where she learned that her truth didn't matter as much as his version of events. And the worst part? She could feel herself considering it, weighing whether fighting this battle was worth the energy. But then something shifted, something so subtle that Mark didn't notice it at first, but Sarah felt it like a key turning in a lock she didn't know existed. Instead of arguing, instead of pulling out her phone to check her calendar or launching into a desperate defense of her own memory, she simply stopped. The knife rested against the cutting board, her breathing slowed, and she let the silence settle around them like snow. This wasn't the compliance he expected, this was something else entirely, something that came from a deeper place within her. She stayed calm in a way that felt almost foreign to her own body, not the forced calm of someone swallowing rage, but the genuine stillness of someone who'd just glimpsed a truth too important to ignore. There was no argument brewing in her throat, no defense forming on her lips, just quiet observation. Sarah looked at Mark, really looked at him, and saw the controlling husband pattern with fresh eyes. She saw how comfortable he was in his denial, how practiced his laugh had become, how certain he was that this moment would end like all the others. The protagonist within her wasn't screaming anymore, she was watching, learning, documenting. Sarah turned back to the vegetables, but her mind was somewhere else entirely, internally grounding herself in what she knew to be true. That conversation happened, she told herself silently, firmly, like planting a flag in solid ground. I'm not crazy. I'm not confused. I'm not stressed or dreaming or misremembering. This internal anchoring felt like finding her footing after months of being pushed off balance. Mark glanced up once, perhaps sensing that something was different about her silence, but then returned to his phone, satisfied that had won this round of their toxic marriage story. He had no idea that the reaction no one expected, least of all Sarah herself, was happening in complete silence. She wasn't fighting him anymore because she had just realized something crucial: you can't win an argument with someone who rewrites reality. The emotional manipulation marriage tactics only worked if she kept engaging with them, kept trying to. Over the next few days, Sarah began to see the pattern with devastating clarity. How many times had that never happened been deployed like a weapon in their marriage? She started mentally cataloging the instances: the promise to attend her work event, the agreement about their budget, the conversation about his mother's visit, the commitment to couples therapy. Each memory she had been told to doubt came rushing back with perfect accuracy, and with each one, she felt her self-trust being rebuilt brick by brick. This recognition of repeated denial wasn't painful anymore, it was liberating. The realization that laughter was his control tool hit her one morning while she was drinking coffee alone in that same kitchen. It wasn't just dismissiveness, it was a calculated strategy to make her feel ridiculous for trusting her own mind. The controlling husband dynamic became so transparent once she stopped trying to convince him and started simply observing. Mark's chuckle, his head shake, his "you must be confused, babe," these weren't innocent misunderstandings or signs of his poor memory. They were instruments of psychological control, and they'd been working perfectly because she'd been giving them power. Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, self-trust replacing doubt like sun burning through fog. She stopped checking her calendar obsessively to prove things to herself. She stopped replaying conversations in her head, searching for where she might have been wrong. Instead, she started trusting that first, clear memory, the one that existed before his gaslighting rewrote the narrative. This female empowerment story was beginning not with dramatic confrontation but with quiet, unshakable certainty about her own reality. The decision to disengage emotionally came naturally, almost automatically, once she understood what was really happening. Sarah realized she didn't need Mark to validate her memories or acknowledge her truth, she just needed to stop handing him the power to define her reality. This dark relationship drama was losing its grip because she was no longer playing her assigned role. She wasn't going to argue, defend, or justify herself anymore. The kitchen gaslighting moment had paradoxically freed her by showing her exactly what she was dealing with, and more importantly, showing her that she had a choice. Sarah started keeping a private journal, not to confront Mark with evidence, but to anchor herself in reality when the gaslighting attempted to pull her under. She documented conversations immediately after they happened, noted promises made, agreements reached, plans discussed. The patterns she had only sensed before became undeniable in black ink on white pages. This wasn't about winning arguments anymore, it was about maintaining her sanity and recognizing the emotional manipulation marriage she had been trapped in. The journal became her witness, her proof that she wasn't losing her mind. But the most definitive action came not in what she recorded, but in how she stopped responding to his reality-bending tactics. When Mark deployed that never happened during a discussion about their vacation plans, Sarah simply nodded and said, "Okay," then proceeded as if the original conversation had indeed occurred, booking the dates they'd agreed upon, making the reservations, moving forward with her truth. There was no confrontation, no scene, no desperate attempt to make him see reason. She'd learned that the controlling husband pattern fed on her need for his validation. The power shifted so quietly that Mark didn't even notice at first. Sarah stopped asking for his confirmation on things they discussed, she just acted on what she knew to be true. When he expressed surprise about her parents visiting without warning, she calmly reminded him once of their conversation, then let it go when he laughed and said those familiar words. But this time, instead of doubting herself or arguing, she simply welcomed her parents as planned. Reality was being anchored outside his narrative, and it was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. This protagonist wasn't waiting for permission to trust herself anymore. The toxic marriage story was reaching its climax not with shouting matches or dramatic revelations, but with Sarah's quiet reclamation of her own mind. She set boundaries without announcing them, declining to engage in circular conversations where he rewrote history, refusing to defend her memory or justify her perceptions. The silent revenge marriage dynamic wasn't about hurting him, it was about protecting herself. And in that protection, in that boundary setting without fanfare, the entire foundation of his control began to crumble. Mark noticed the shift about 3 weeks later, though he couldn't quite articulate what had changed. He tried the old tactics, laughing off a conversation about their finances, joking that Sarah's memory was playing tricks on her again, but this time, her reaction was different. She didn't take the bait. She didn't argue or pull out evidence or even look particularly bothered. She just continued doing what she'd planned based on their original discussion, and her calm indifference left him grasping at air where her emotional response used to be. The confusion on his face would have been satisfying if Sarah had any energy left to care about his reaction. He tried to minimize her behavior, asking if she was feeling okay or suggesting she seemed distant lately, his tone carrying that same manipulative concern he'd always used. But the gaslighting technique that had worked for years was suddenly ineffective, like a key that no longer fit the lock because someone had changed the tumblers. When control slips without resistance, without the fight that usually accompanied it, the controller doesn't know how to respond. Mark's attempts became more frequent and slightly more desperate, though he tried to hide it behind his usual casual demeanor. "Come on, babe, don't be like this," he'd say when she calmly stated a fact he was trying to deny, as if her refusal to doubt herself was somehow an attack on him. The controlling husband was discovering that his authority only existed because she'd been granting it, believing that his version of reality mattered more than her own. Now that she'd stopped participating in that dynamic, his power dissolved like sugar in water. There was a moment Sarah would remember it clearly when Mark actually raised his voice for the first time in years, frustrated that his usual tools weren't working. "Why are you being so stubborn about this?" he demanded when she moved forward with plans he claimed they'd never discussed. But even his anger bounced off her newfound clarity like rain off glass. This emotional power reversal wasn't something she was doing to him, it was something she was doing for herself. And watching him scramble to regain control he'd never actually earned was the moment she knew this dark relationship drama was nearing its end. Sarah learned that denial loses all its power the moment you stop doubting yourself. It's a magic trick that only works when the audience believes in the illusion. The "that never happened" phrase that had haunted her for years became nothing more than words, empty and meaningless, once she anchored herself in her own truth. She didn't need Mark to admit he was gaslighting her, didn't need him to acknowledge the conversations they'd had or apologize for the years of emotional manipulation marriage tactics. His validation had become irrelevant because she'd found something far more valuable: unwavering trust in herself. The hardest lesson was recognizing that laughter can hide cruelty, that humor can be a mask for control, that someone can dismantle your reality while smiling and never raising their voice. This toxic marriage story wasn't filled with the obvious red flags people warn you about: no screaming, no physical violence, no overt threats. Just a steady erosion of her sense of self, wrapped in jokes and dismissiveness, and the constant refrain that her memory, her perception, her reality couldn't be trusted. The kitchen gaslighting had been happening for so long that she'd normalized it, accepted it as just how Mark was rather than recognizing it as abuse. But clarity breaks psychological spells with a force that's almost miraculous. Once Sarah saw the pattern for what it was, once she named the controlling husband behavior and understood the mechanics of gaslighting, she couldn't unsee it. Every "that never happened" became transparent, every laugh revealed itself as a weapon, every dismissal showed its true purpose. This female empowerment story wasn't about her becoming stronger or braver, it was about her simply remembering who she had always been before someone convinced her to doubt that person. The protagonist had been there all along, just buried under years of manufactured uncertainty. Silence backed by truth restores power in ways that arguments never could. Sarah didn't need to convince Mark, didn't need to win debates or present evidence or make him see what he was doing. She just needed to trust herself completely and act accordingly, moving through the world based on her own solid reality rather than his shifting narratives. The emotional power reversal was complete not when he admitted fault never did but when his opinion of her truth simply stopped mattering. And in that moment of liberation, standing in that same kitchen where it had all crystallized, she understood that the spell had only ever worked because she'd been the one giving it power all along. So hey race where we land, standing in the wreckage and the rebuilding of what happens when you finally choose yourself over someone else's version of reality. Sarah's story may be your story, maybe the story of someone you love doesn't end with a dramatic confrontation or a satisfying apology from the person who spent years denying her truth. It ends with something quieter and infinitely more powerful, the unshakable knowledge that she was right all along, that her memory was valid, that her reality deserved to exist without needing anyone's permission or validation. The emotional manipulation marriage dynamics we've explored here aren't rare, they're devastatingly common, hidden in homes that look happy from the outside, thriving in relationships where I love you and that never happened somehow coexist. But recognition is the first step toward freedom. When you can name the gaslighting, when you can see the controlling husband pattern for what it truly is, when you understand that laughter can be a weapon and denial can be abusive, that's when the spell starts to break. That's when you begin the journey back to trusting the one person who's been with you all along, yourself. Now I want you to pause and ask yourself some hard questions, the kind that might make your stomach clench but your soul exhale with relief. How many times have you doubted your own memory because someone else insisted you were wrong? This dark relationship drama we've walked through together, from kitchen gaslighting to silent revenge marriage, from toxic patterns to emotional power reversal, isn't just a story to consume and forget. It's a mirror, an invitation, a roadmap for anyone who's ever felt their reality slipping through their fingers while someone they loved told them they were imagining things. You deserve to live in your own truth. You deserve relationships where your memory is respected, where your perceptions matter, where that never happened is reserved for actual misunderstandings, not systematic erasure of your lived experience. If this resonated with you, if you saw yourself in Sarah's kitchen or felt that familiar knot of recognition in your chest, I want you to do something for yourself right now. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Not because I need the numbers, but because you deserve to be reminded regularly that your reality is valid, that gaslighting is real, and that you're not crazy. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because somewhere right now, someone is standing in their kitchen, hearing that never happened, and wondering if they're losing their mind. What will you choose to trust today, someone else's denial, or your own unshakable knowing?